Minister O'Gorman, in June of 2022, independent TD Carol Nolan warned that if Ireland's immigration system continued the way it was going with no cap on asylum, the country wouldn't be able to provide emergency accommodation for either its own citizens or for genuine asylum seekers. And she said that the numbers of people arriving into the country were, quote, unsustainable given the state's accommodation capacity. And in response at the time, Housing Minister Darragh O'Brien said that her comments were a threat to social cohesion.
We must tread carefully here if we're to avoid blame being targeted at those who least deserve it. But I'm also absolutely convinced that if we do not learn to find some way of exploring in a grown-up, pragmatic and constructive way the links between unsustainable levels of inward migration or asylum into this state and housing, then we are never going to find a meaningful solution to what is already an overwhelming crisis. One Fine Gael deputy describing the impact of the UK government Rwanda policy as a runaway train coming down the track at us, and we have no way to stop it. All of this means that Ireland's capacity to provide even the bare minimum of emergency accommodation and shelter to its own citizens and those genuinely fleeing war is being severely undermined.
Deputy, I respectfully say that your comments here this afternoon pose a risk to social cohesion. I want to be very clear on behalf of the government.
That's outrageous.
So I'm just wondering, and I might get Minister Foley's thoughts on this as well, since everything Nolan said has clearly been demonstrated to be true, and she was obviously right now in hindsight, doesn't the government owe Carol Nolan an apology for accusing her of undermining social cohesion by pointing out the situation we're now in effectively?
I think in that time in 2022 we were facing two major crises. One occasioned by the war in Ukraine and the millions of Ukrainians who were moving across the European continent, biggest movement of people since the Second World War, and secondly the increase in international protection applicants, again felt across all of Europe. I think this government has responded to both of those crises to the very best of its capacity. I've always recognised the response hasn't been perfect. I would have recognised it back in early 2022 as well, and I recognise it was going to be difficult. But we have changed policy in terms of the Ukrainian crisis, recognising we aren't seeing the large outflows of people from Ukraine that we saw at the end of the war. Those changes in policy means we're seeing much smaller numbers of Ukrainians seeking seeking temporary protection here. We're actually seeing substantial numbers of Ukrainians leaving our state-provided accommodation, some finding their own way here, some returning to Ukraine, some moving elsewhere. In terms of international protection, the challenge still remains, but we also have to be clear, we can't just place artificial caps because we have international law obligations and we are doing our best as a country to meet those international law obligations. We recognise we need to change our system. That's why work happening in my department to improve the provision of accommodation, and also work in the Department of Justice in terms of speeding up the processing times, giving people their decision. Yes, you're a refugee here. No, you're not. You're asked to leave, and if not, deportation.
But do you think that it was unfair of Minister O'Brien to accuse Deputy Nolan of undermining social cohesion by pointing out that we would run out of accommodation and we would end up in a crisis situation, which is now very obviously materialised, notwithstanding all the obvious challenges that you've outlined?
Well, look, I would have a very different starting point on these issues to Deputy Nolan, and I certainly don't think she's owed an apology, no.
Minister Foley,